Hello film fans and welcome to this episode of the Sherlockian. Now, I was looking through BBC iPlayer the other day and I happened to see that under one of the trending topics was David Attenborough's Natural Curiosities. And I don't really know why it's trending so much at the moment, but I thought it'd be worth a look because actually it's one of my favourite sort of short documentary series I think the BBC have ever done. It's quite an unusual series for the BBC to have put together, really, because most of their kind of sort of their showpiece documentaries are normally at least an hour long, and generally speaking, they only get David Attenborough in to do those kind of big set pieces, and then get somebody in like a Steve Backshall to do kind of the shorter documentaries. But this one is kind of a bit of an exception to that rule, and it's a absolutely brilliant idea. It basically looks at kind of things that we take for granted about the natural world. So, for example, the fact that butterflies come from caterpillars, or I don't know, things like that duckbill platypuses exist, and it looks at things like that, which we take for granted, but actually, when you boil them down, are actually really weird, and basically looks at the history of how people actually discovered them in the first place. So there's absolutely tons of episodes, and I can't go through all of them, but three of my favourite features in them I thought I'd bring out and have a bit of a look at them, because it's absolutely fascinating some of the stories these documentaries uncover. So, for example, we all know that cuckoos lay their eggs in other birds' nests. It's kind of like a basic fact of natural history. And indeed, people have known about this for a very, very long time because obviously egg collecting was basically kind of like early scientific research, shall we say. Um, and basically, people have noticed that sometimes in certain birds' eggs, you get an egg that was slightly different, and obviously somebody at some point had watched this happen and seen a cuckoo lay its egg in another bird's nest and realised that kind of there was this parasite behaviour going on. But people had never really bothered to study this until about, I think it was the late 18th century, when a man called Edward Jenner decided to investigate. Now, you've probably heard of Edward Jenner because he's very famous, because he basically came up with the first mainstream smallpox vaccination. It wasn't the first vaccination attempt to try and vaccinate smallpox. It'd been going on, I think, in Turkey since about the 16th century, but Jenner really popularised it because previous attempts to vaccinate against smallpox had basically just been to vaccinate people with kind of pus from people that have had smallpox. So often people died because it just gave them smallpox and it killed them. So it was kind of a bit of a very controversial topic. There's actually stories about people, burning down early vaccination centres because they considered, the vaccine to be worse than actually getting smallpox. But Jenner's idea of vaccinating people with cowpox, which is obviously a milder form of smallpox, which then means that you don't get smallpox, basically caught on and basically helped to eradicate smallpox virtually worldwide. But Jenner apparently, according to David Attenborough, first came to fame by his discoveries about the natural history of the cuckoo. Now, I don't know why Jenner decided to do this, but basically he investigated how cuckoos laid their eggs in other birds' nests, and it had been previously thought that the reason that obviously only the cuckoo chick survived was because the cuckoo came along, it ate all the other birds' eggs in the nest and then laid its own. And it's very understandable, but it's wrong. The cuckoo actually only eats one, which I've always thought, does that mean that some birds can actually count in small numbers? But anyway, it only eats one, lays its egg, and then it's of course the baby cuckoo that actually kills all the other nestlings. Now, they show this in the documentary in some quite gory detail, and along with Jenner's original observations. And it's quite fascinating because the way a baby cuckoo kills the other birds' eggs, well, normally the eggs, but sometimes the nestlings if they've already hatched, it basically kind of uses its back to kind of heave them up, a bit like kind of a deadlift. And it's actually amazing because obviously it's completely blind when it does this. It lifts them up and then kind of throws them off the back of the nest and kills them. And obviously it's quite a kind of a visceral piece of natural biology, but it's quite fascinating. And it's interesting that Jenner's discoveries were initially, some people were quite sceptical. Now, you often get this with any scientific discovery, partly just because scientists tend to be quite cynical, but also because I imagine some people are a little bit jealous and they'd probably rather not believe it if they can possibly help it. But apparently he was accepted as a fellow of the Royal Society, which is pretty good going, and presumably helped then to make his investigations into smallpox that bit more kind of convincing. Um, if a fellow, Mr. Edward Jenner, comes along from the Royal Society and says, "I'd like to inoculate your daughter," you're more likely to do it than just Mr. Edward Jenner, the local GP. But anyway, I digress. The other story, and I remember this from the first time I watched this series, the absolutely amazing story about how they discovered emperor penguins nested in the winter. Now, we've all heard of Captain Scott and his famous expedition to the Antarctic. Actually, he made more than one. But on obviously his last expedition, when he tried to reach the South Pole before Amundsen and was unsuccessful, he arrived a week later than Amundsen did, and he obviously later died. It's famous for the famous story about Captain Oates, who he's dying and he knows he's slowing the rest of the expedition down. He says, "I'm just going outside, and maybe sometime," and walks off out into the blizzard. It's obviously it's very famous kind of British historical story. Almost it's gone down in almost myth. It's so famous. But there's an interesting side story to this, which is that basically Scott's doctor and his the expedition's naturalist Edward Wilson was basically instrumental in his observations on emperor penguins. Now, in their first expedition, the expedition discovered there was a colony of emperor penguins, which had only been recently discovered anyway. So they were, obviously quite interested to see them in the wild. And so they go off there. And Wilson was shocked to see that the baby emperor penguins were already fairly well grown. And he worked out from this that they must therefore have laid their eggs in the winter. Now, Wilson did all these incredible sketches, which David Attenborough looks at in detail, and they're gorgeous, particularly as he was actually doing them at the time, in the middle of the Antarctic, watching these emperor penguins. He was sketching away, and apparently could only work for a few minutes at a time each because it was so cold, and presumably you can't actually sketch in mittens very easily, so he must have been wearing sort of gloves and therefore had to make sure his hands weren't going to get frostbite. And it was absolutely incredible how beautiful they are, especially considering the conditions he was working under. Anyway, he basically did these amazing sketches, amazing, very detailed observations about what he saw. But what they really wanted, of course, was they wanted some specimens, because that's how kind of 19th century, I mean, I know this is the early 20th century, but they still had that kind of 19th century scientific mindset. That was kind of how science worked at the time. The idea was that you basically went somewhere, you shot something, probably anyway. I mean, David Attenborough doesn't go into a lot of detail how they acquired their specimens, but I suspect they did. Anyway, you'd go somewhere, collect some specimens, and then you come back and say, "There you are, here's what I've discovered," and people would examine them. So anyway, basically, on their second expedition, Wilson, Bowers, and a third member of the expedition called Garrett, I think his name was, and basically they were sent to go and basically collect some eggs and to collect some specimens of dead chicks. Now, it was thought that the eggs in particular would actually provide interesting evolutionary information about the evolution of penguins. It was thought that emperor penguins, especially because they look a little bit reptilian, they were actually a kind of missing link between reptiles and birds. Now, it's easy to see how somebody could come up with that idea, but of course it's not actually true, which kind of gives that expedition that kind of, like almost that kind of tragic air, doesn't it? The idea they were actually going to do something that was slightly pointless. But anyway, they did this incredible trek. I can't remember how many days they had to march for, but it was a fairly long time. Through the snow, apparently they had to chip away at their sleeping bags for an hour each night just to get into them because they froze them during the day. They were hauling these heavy wooden sledges. They got to the colony, collected the eggs, came back. They apparently hid them in their mittens to try and make sure that they didn't break, although two of them did. And they only just made it back in one piece. And it's absolutely an incredible story, this heroic scientific investigation. And it's even more incredibly tragic because Bowers and Wilson then went on with Scott to try and reach the South Pole and ultimately died. So it's actually sad on multiple levels. It's an incredible story. And it's an absolute, it's like a scientific, almost like a heroic scientific story from the age of exploration. But ultimately, the reason they were doing it was wrong, and they died anyway later on. But it was absolutely incredible and a really, really cool story. And David Attenborough tells it so brilliantly. I mean, obviously, he does these things very well anyway, but he tells it with the exact right tone of kind of pathos and kind of just romanticism, while not sort of sparing you the kind of the, sort of the scientific details. And then the third bit, which I enjoyed, because it kind of, as the series goes on, you get the impression that they kind of were starting to run out of more historical stories to tell. So they sort of switched to more interesting, like modern ones. And they talk about this brilliant, basically, investigation to how fast cheetahs run. Now, I'm sure you've heard it said that cheetahs can run 70 miles an hour. In fact, I've heard it over 70 miles an hour. If you just Google it randomly, it comes up with all these incredible figures. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. Some people say about 60, others say, 65, 70, 75. Basically, no one really knows until now, because David Attenborough looks at this investigation into by the, I think it was the Royal Veterinary College in London, using these kind of GPS um, satellite tracking collars, which basically recorded how fast the animals moved. Now, first of all, they tested them on like greyhounds and lurchers to make sure they actually worked. Then they tested them on captive cheetahs to make sure they weren't intrusive, and then finally they put them on wild ones. And what's fascinating is that apparently the original speed of 70 miles an hour comes from a study. I can't remember what it was done now, but like early 20th century, which was basically done before kind of what like modern like speed checking equipment was even really a thing. So they basically used a bicycle, like an upside down bicycle wheel, like a bicycle without handlebars. So basically you spin it, and that would mean the lure would come along. So before even kind of like electric motors were really even a thing. That's actually, they did have electric motors, but clearly they couldn't use them because they weren't fast enough yet. Anyway, that got the cheetah to run, and they basically then timed it using a stopwatch and a starting pistol. So it was incredibly archaic, and they came up with the speed of 71 miles an hour. Now, the Royal Veterinary College basically did their tests, and they came up basically with the fastest a wild cheetah ran during the test was 58 miles an hour, which is nowhere near as fast. Now, David Attenborough says, sort of takes this as kind of gospel. Now, I'm slightly more sceptical, not because I think the original study was more accurate, because clearly it wasn't, but I sort of think if you look at those tests, they were clearly doing them in straight lines. Whereas wild cheetahs don't run in straight lines because their quarry doesn't run in straight lines. They actually tend to run almost like a circle, and you could see that from the GPS sort of like tracking system they were looking at. So a bit of me thinks, if you could actually get a cheetah to run properly in a straight line, and it's very difficult to get captive cheetahs to actually run properly at all, you could actually. I reckon they'd certainly go over 60. I don't think they'd get to 70, but they would certainly be going quicker than 58. But nevertheless, it makes for interesting further study. Actually, I was looking it up because I was trying to see whether there are any other kind of figures to sort of like back this kind of study up. I actually found that in 1937 they actually trained cheetahs to run on like greyhound tracks. Now I don't think they ever properly timed them, but they basically raced them against greyhounds to try and sort of prove how fast they were. And the cheetahs apparently always won easily without really even having to really bother. But what's funny is that often, whereas greyhounds, you can sort of basically get them to run like constantly. They don't ever seem to get tired of running and chasing things. Cheetahs, because they're cats, are just really, really lazy. So often they just lost interest and were like, why am I chasing this lure again around in a big circle? And we just stop, which I really quite enjoy. As somebody that actually used to own a greyhound, it surprises me that there is anything lazier than a greyhound because they generally spend most of their time asleep. But apparently there is. But anyway, that was my review of David Attenborough's Natural Curiosities. It's an absolutely great show, and if you haven't checked it out, I'd really recommend it. It's absolutely fantastic. It really takes an in-depth look at kind of very simple, basic biological stuff, but the history of how people actually discovered that stuff in the first place. I hope you've enjoyed this review. I know it was very quick and very short. If you're interested, you can subscribe to the channel. There is obviously you can click on the notification button below. There's also a link to my Twitter page in the video description. But anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.